Good afternoon, or shall I say, late evening. We're going to start this video as soon as I get a connection. And here we go. Again, good afternoon, good evening. Let's get with it. This is going to be a enlightening Bible study. When African Americans said they are biblical Israelites, how did European Edomites react? How is the world of European Edomites and Western theologians react to the awakening of African Americans who now proclaim to be the promised seed of Abraham?
This is time.
That is a clear picture of how Europeans have reacted to the recent surge of African Americans now claiming to be the promised seed of Abraham and biblical Israelites described in the Bible. That is how they have reacted. The response of European descendants of Edom was to introduce a test. A test is now being administered, not for COVID-19, but to inoculate the world from learning the true identity of the promised seed of Abraham. What does Psalms 83 and DNA testing and DNA tests that allege to identify a person's nationality have in common? Is there any relationship between the sudden use of DNA tests and Psalms 83? First, let's look at what Psalms 83 has to say, and then let's think about whether or not this sudden surge of DNA tests that has come on the scene has any relationship to Psalms 83. Psalms 83 says, "Keep not thy silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thy enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee, the tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Jebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Ashur also is joined with them. They have holpen the children of Lot, Selah. That is the relevant part of Psalms 83 that I want to read so that we can see if there's any type of correlation between the sudden introduction of these DNA tests to determine one's nationality. The descendants of Edom and Amalek, spoken of in Psalms 83, are using DNA tests to falsely identify white Europeans as the promised seed of Abraham. No DNA test or blood analysis can accurately identify the biological lineage born from the promised seed of Abraham. No scientific procedure can identify the promised seed of Abraham. Western theologians and scientists first used the Bible to assert the false claim that European descendants of Edom were the promised seed of Abraham. Later, in the 18th and 19th century, the descendants of Edom employed Charles Darwin. Yes, in the 19th century, the descendants of Edom employed Charles Darwin to promote a false scientific theory of evolution to justify Edom as the promised seed of Abraham. When I say the descendants of Edom, I mean European theologians and Europeans who are descendants of Edom. Now, in 2021, the descendants of Edom have introduced DNA tests to support this false assertion of being the promised seed of Abraham. Nevertheless, none of the above scientific and biblical claims are supported by scripture. The promotion of companies such as Ancestry.com is to merely provide another scientific excuse, explanation, and argument to justify white European Jews' claim to be the promised seed of Abraham. It is patently obvious God did not describe DNA tests in the Bible to identify his chosen people. Without question, the use of DNA tests by companies such as Ancestry.com and European theologians to identify the promised seed of Abraham is a fraudulent misrepresentation and substitution of the biblical criteria used to identify those born from the promised seed of Abraham. Without question, God never employed DNA tests to find the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The method used to identify descendants of Abraham's promised seed requires that a man be born from the biological lineage of Abraham's promised seed. The promised seed of Abraham is only those men born from the biological lineage of Isaac, Jacob, Israel, and the 12 sons of Israel who became known as the nation of Israel. The promised seed of Abraham is derived and identified by the seed of his father, that is sperm of his father. This is clearly and unequivocally shown in Romans chapter 9, verse 7 through 9, which sheds light on the relevance of the seed of a man and the seed of Abraham in particular. Let's look at Romans chapter 9, verses 7 through 9, which says, neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh. These are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. For this is the word of promise. At this time will I come, and Sarah shall have a son. Also, look at Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. Let's look at that and see what it says about the promised seed of Abraham. Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, where it says, "And he said unto Abram, know of a certainty that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years." This is what is described in the Bible that would happen to the seed of Abraham, the promised seed of Abraham. Now, let's look at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 64 and 68, where it talks about the promised seed of Abraham and how we can identify the promised seed of Abraham. Deuteronomy 28, chapter 60, verse 64 says, "And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone." Yes. Now let's look at verse 68, where it says, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondsmen and bondswomen, and no man shall buy you." These are the scriptures concerning the promised seed of Abraham. These are scriptures that identify the promised seed of Abraham, not DNA tests. These scriptures are God's scientific method of identity of his promised seed. This is the way God determines who is the biological descendants of Abraham's promised seed. The promised seed of Abraham is defined and identified by scripture, not a man-made fantasy. Yes, let's make that very clear. The promised seed of Abraham is defined and identified by scripture, not a man-made fantasy. Scripture shows the promised seed of Abraham would experience events that can be used to identify their presence. This is evidence by Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, and Deuteronomy 28, 64, and 68 that we just read. The very claim by white Europeans to be the promised seed of Abraham is nonsensical in view of the clear, detailed physical description of Jesus and the nation of Israel as a black-skinned nation of people who lived in Africa. Yes. The events in the Bible and the life and times of the promised seed of Abraham all occurred on the African continent. They did not occur in Europe. The allegation Europeans are the promised seed of Abraham is just nonsensical. Here's a hypothetical example. Let's imagine two men claim that their horse was the fastest. One man owned a horse that ran in the Kentucky Derby and won the Kentucky Derby. The other man owned a horse that ran and won the Florida Derby. And they were arguing about whose horse was the fastest. And while they were making this argument, a third man overheard them and walked up and said, "My horse is faster than both of y'all horses. And I bet you $500,000 that my horse can outrace both of y'all horses." So they all met the next Sunday at the racetrack, the horse racetrack. And the two men showed up with their horses. However, the third man showed up with a 2021 Mercedes-Benz with a 400 horsepower motor, claiming his car was the same as a horse. The only difference was his car had more horsepower. It actually had 400 times more horsepower than the other two men's horse. And he insisted there was no difference between his 400 horsepower car and the animals that were going to race. The race was actually held, but only the animals participated in the race because it was obviously clear a car is not a horse, and the horse owners were not fools. The use of DNA tests or the employment of companies such as Ancestry.com to determine the identity of the promised seed of Abraham is as nonsensical as saying there is no difference between a horse and a car. Just because you call a car a horse does not make a car a horse. Just because you call the test result of a DNA test the promised seed of Abraham does not make a test result the promised seed of Abraham. However, the buffoonery of using DNA tests to identify a person's national identity, even one's biological lineage to the Levite priesthood, has become acceptable. Unbelievable. Companies such as Ancestry.com have gained credibility among African Americans by using Black entertainers and Black celebrities to validate the false conclusions of DNA tests. The real target of DNA testing is African Americans, because African Americans are waking up and beginning to learn they are the people written of in the Bible as the promised seed of Abraham, who came to America as slaves, prophesied in Deuteronomy 28 that we read earlier. DNA tests are now used to divert African Americans away from the biblical criteria God used to identify his promised seed of Abraham. African Americans are now strongly encouraged to accept and use a non-biblical criteria to identify their nationality. Of course, this is being promoted by European imposters who claim to be the promised seed of Abraham. Revelations chapter 2, verse 9 speak of imposters. Read that. They say they are Jews, but they're not. God says he know you. Read Revelations chapter 2, verse 9. Do not be deceived. Do not believe the hype. Do not believe your national identity is determined by a scientific test created by men described in the Bible as the enemies of Israel. Yes, the DNA tests were created by the descendants of Edom and Amalek mentioned in Psalms 83. Read Psalms 83. Americans are the true Hebrews, ignited the need of Edom to invent a new scientific method to explain away what is now revealed by God. Yes, the European descendants of Edom are in panic mode, trying to provide an alternative narrative and an alternative criteria for African Americans to understand their true national identity. Ancestry.com and the sudden interest in providing African Americans with a process to determine their national identity is not a haphazard event. Do not believe the hype. DNA tests are not in the Bible. God is not the author of confusion or DNA tests. Now, I want you to listen to this about these DNA tests. I want you to listen to this about these DNA tests and see how nonsensical this thing called DNA testing is. Let's get this video running. Here we go. Technology.
I learned from you. You teach me so many things about these DNA tests. Here's when I asked her about MyHeritage. I'm on MyHeritage on my app here. As we all know, when you go to Europe, which obviously I'm 77.6% European, when I go there and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, of course I go to all supported ethnicities. Now, even though my mom and my sister show up as part Jewish, I don't. But at the bottom, it says Ashkenazi Jewish and 0%, but it's categorized with Europe. Now, remember, I'm the American, so my perception of things is way off, right? I get that, I own up to that. But it's interesting because when I think of anyone who's Jewish, I automatically think Middle Eastern. It's an ethnic group from the Middle East. So it's interesting to me that it's grouped with Europe. So that just throws me off. And I get it that there are European Jewish people compared to people who are Middle East that are more likely, like my mom shows up as 15.2% Sephardic Jewish. So Sephardic Jewish is, that's I guess more of a Southern European strand of the Jewish DNA. Compare that to Northern. Just help me sort that out. Why is Ashkenazi Jewish grouped in with the European? That just throws me off. I don't quite understand why it's there. And I don't know, because if you go to Africa, then there's Ethiopian Jewish. And, for my mom, it's a Sephardic Jewish / North African that shows up in North Africa. So, okay. See, because in my mind, Sephardic Jewish is Spanish Jewish kind of, and maybe Italian Jewish, Southern European Jewish. But according to MyHeritage, it's grouped with, Sephardic Jewish is grouped with North African. And then Ashkenazi is grouped with Europe. It just in my mind, again, I'm a silly American who doesn't understand things. In my mind, there would just be a different group altogether that maybe just says Jewish, and that would be its own thing instead of.
Pausing will return. Well, this thing is pausing. But I'm just going to say, God is not the author of confusion. God did not write a chapter in the Bible explaining how the descendants of Edom became the promised seed of Abraham. God is not the author of confusion, nor the sponsor of Ancestry.com. God did not create DNA testing. DNA testing and Ancestry.com are not mentioned in the Bible. It is hard to believe African Americans are so profoundly naive, overtly trustful, easily deceived, and led to believe a test created by the descendants of Edom proves African Americans are not the promised seed of Abraham. The enemies of Israel are clever, but God will not be mocked. Many of God's lost sheep do not know their national identity is Israel, but God knows who they are. The awakening continues.